Imagine an emperor watching his elite soldiers, men who had conquered vast territories, get utterly annihilated by warriors they had dismissed as mere barbarians. Picture that same emperor, a symbol of immense power, choosing to fall on his own sword rather than endure the shame of capture. Think about an army from a global empire, equipped with modern rifles and cannons, being completely overwhelmed and wiped out in just a few short hours by fighters wielding spears and shields. Consider the devastating blow of losing 4 of your nation's biggest, most advanced aircraft carriers, the very heart of your naval power, all in a single terrible morning, a loss that would tilt the balance of a world war. And what if a confident general, dreaming of swift victory and glory, saw his meticulously planned campaign unravel as his forces were cleverly lured into a deadly trap, their renowned discipline and training proving useless against hidden enemies and treacherous unfamiliar terrain? History is filled with such moments, battles where everything went wrong for one side, changing their fortunes, and sometimes the world forever. Dien Bien Phu, 1954. The Valley of Broken Dreams. In the early 1950s, France was struggling to hold on to its colony in Indochina, which we now know as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The Viet Minh, a Vietnamese nationalist and communist movement led by Ho Chi Minh and a brilliant general named Vu Nguyen Giap, were fighting fiercely for independence. The French military command, under General Henri Navarre, decided on a bold plan. They would establish a massive, heavily fortified air-supplied base deep in enemy territory at a place called Dien Bien Phu. The idea was to lure General Giap's Viet Minh forces into a set-piece battle where superior French firepower and air support would crush them. In November 1953, French paratroopers dropped into the valley of Dien Bien Phu, a basin surrounded by jungle-covered hills, and began constructing their fortress. They built strongpoints named after French women: Gabrielle, Beatrice, Isabelle. Colonel Christian de Castries was put in command of the garrison, which eventually numbered around 16,000 French Union troops, including French regulars, foreign legionnaires, and colonial soldiers from Africa and Vietnam. They were confident, perhaps too confident. They believed the Viet Minh couldn't possibly bring heavy artillery through the dense jungle and up the steep hills overlooking the valley. They were tragically wrong. General Giap accepted the challenge. Under his direction, tens of thousands of Viet Minh soldiers and civilian porters performed an incredible feat of logistics. They manually dragged heavy artillery pieces, piece by piece, through seemingly impassable terrain, often under the cover of darkness or camouflage, and positioned them in well-concealed bunkers on the hillsides, overlooking every part of the French base. They even dug extensive trench systems, slowly encircling the French position. The French were largely unaware of the scale of this buildup. The Viet Minh assault began on March 13, 1954. The French were shocked by the intensity and accuracy of the Viet Minh artillery barrage. Strongpoint Beatrice fell on the first night, followed quickly by Gabrielle. The French airstrip, crucial for supplies and reinforcements, was soon rendered unusable by the shelling. The French found themselves trapped, under constant fire, in a muddy, shrinking perimeter. The monsoon rains turned the valley into a quagmire. French soldiers fought bravely in desperate conditions, but supplies dwindled. Air dropped reinforcements, and supplies often missed their mark, falling into Viet Minh hands. Attempts to counter-attack failed against the well-dug in Viet Minh. The French artillery commander, Colonel Charles Pirot, devastated by his inability to silence the Viet Minh guns as he had promised, took his own life. One by one, the French strongpoints were overrun in brutal, close quarters. Fighting. After a 56-day siege, on May 7, 1954, The remaining French forces at Dien Bien Phu surrendered. Around 2,200 French Union soldiers had been killed during the siege, and over 11,000 were taken prisoner. Many of the prisoners died during brutal, forced marches to Viet Minh camps, or from disease and malnutrition in captivity. The loss at Dien Bien Phu was a shattering blow to French morale and prestige. The battle directly led to the Geneva Accords of 1954, which marked the end of the First Indochina War and the formal end of French colonial rule in Indochina. Vietnam was temporarily divided into North and South, setting the stage for future conflicts. Number 13. Midway, 1942. Pacific tide turns in minutes. 6 months after the stunning attack on Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy seemed unstoppable. They had conquered vast territories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, planned another decisive blow: to seize Midway Atoll, a strategically vital American airbase northwest of Hawaii, and lure the remaining U.S. Pacific Fleet carriers into a battle where they could be destroyed. Yamamoto committed a massive fleet, including 4 of his best aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. They believed they held the element of surprise and overwhelming naval superiority. What the Japanese didn't know was that American naval intelligence, led by Joseph Rochefort, had broken key Japanese naval codes. U.S. Admiral Chester, Nimitz commander of the Pacific Fleet, knew Yamamoto's plans, target, and approximate timetable. Nimitz had only 3 carriers available: USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, hastily repaired after damage in the Battle of the Coral Sea. He set a trap for the Japanese. The battle began on June 4th, 1942. Japanese planes from Nagumo's carriers attacked Midway Atoll. While this attack was happening, American carrier planes searched for the Japanese fleet. First waves of American torpedo bombers found the Japanese carriers but were slaughtered by Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Nearly all were shot down without scoring a hit. It seemed like another Japanese victory was unfolding, but then luck and timing dramatically shifted. As Nagumo's carriers were rearming and refueling their planes for a second strike, with bombs and torpedoes scattered on their hangar decks, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown arrived high overhead almost by chance at the perfect moment of vulnerability. Within about 5 devastating minutes, dive bombers led by Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey and Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie struck. Bombs ripped through the decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, igniting fuel lines and stored ordnance. The ships were turned into blazing infernos. All 3 were fatally damaged and later sank or were scuttled. The Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, launched counterattacks that severely damaged the USS Yorktown, which later sank. But later that afternoon, American planes found and bombed the Hiryu as well. It too was crippled and sank the next day. Japan lost all 4 of its front-line fleet carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, along with over 250 aircraft and, crucially, a large number of its most experienced pilots and aircrew, who could not be easily replaced. The U.S. lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, and about 150 aircraft. The Battle of Midway was a stunning and catastrophic defeat for Japan. It halted Japan's eastward expansion in the Pacific. The loss of 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers and so many veteran pilots crippled the Imperial Japanese Navy's offensive capabilities. From that point on, Japan was largely on the defensive in the Pacific War. Number 12, Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943. Hitler's Sixth Army vanishes. In the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler, confident after initial successes on the Eastern Front, ordered his German forces to push south into the Soviet Union. The goal was to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and the strategically important city of Stalingrad, now Volgograd, on the Volga River. Taking Stalingrad, named after Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, would also be a huge propaganda victory. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, spearheaded the assault on the city, which began in August 1942. What followed was some of the most brutal and relentless urban warfare in history. The city was reduced to rubble by German bombing and artillery. Soviet soldiers under the command of General Vasily Chukov defended every street, every building, every factory with ferocious determination. The fighting was often hand-to-hand, in cellars, sewers, and shattered ruins. Life expectancy for a new soldier arriving at the front line was sometimes measured in hours. The Germans, slowly, bloodily, pushed the Soviets back towards the Volga River, but they could never fully dislodge them. The Soviets clung to narrow strips of land on the river's west bank, supplied precariously from the east bank. While the Germans were fixated on capturing the city block by block, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov was planning a massive counteroffensive. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. Huge Soviet forces attacked the weaker Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies, guarding the flanks of the German Sixth Army. The flanks collapsed quickly, and within days the Soviets had encircled Paulus's entire Sixth Army, around 300,000 German and Allied soldiers, inside Stalingrad. Hitler forbade Paulus from attempting to break out. He promised the Sixth Army would be supplied by air through an air bridge. But the Luftwaffe, hampered by bad weather and Soviet air defenses, could only deliver a fraction of the needed supplies. Inside the Kessel cauldron, the German soldiers faced starvation, freezing temperatures, disease, and relentless Soviet attacks. Ammunition ran low. A German relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, was launched in December, but was halted by determined Soviet resistance, far short of Stalingrad. Conditions for the trapped Germans became horrific. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was shattered. Paulus requested permission from Hitler to surrender to save his remaining men, but Hitler refused, demanding they fight to the last man, and promoting Paulus to field marshal. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. However, on January 31, 1943, Paulus, holed up in the basement of a department store, surrendered his remaining forces in the southern pocket of the Kessel. The last German troops in the northern pocket surrendered on February 2nd. Around 91,000 survivors were taken prisoner, but only about 50 to 60 of them ever returned to Germany after the war, most dying in Soviet captivity. The German losses were catastrophic, not just the men of the Sixth Army, but vast amounts of equipment. The Battle of Stalingrad was a decisive turning point on the Eastern Front of World War II. It was a massive blow to German morale and military strength, from which the Wehrmacht never fully recovered. For the Soviet Union, it was a symbol of resilience and ultimate victory. Number 11. Izandlwana, 1879. Spears against rifles, and spears won. In January 1879, the British Empire, at the height of its power, invaded Zululand in southern Africa. The British High Commissioner, Sir Henry Bartle Frere, saw the independent Zulu kingdom with its powerful army as a threat to British interests. Lord Chelmsford led the British invasion force, which advanced into Zululand in 3 columns. On January 20th, the central column, under Chelmsford's direct command, set up camp at the foot of a distinctive sphinx-shaped hill called Izandlwana. Chelmsford had around 4,700 troops, including British regulars armed with Martini Henry rifles and artillery, as well as colonial volunteers, and Natal native contingent soldiers. He underestimated the Zulu army, believing their traditional weapons, short stabbing spears, ikla, and cowhide shields, were no match for modern firepower. On the morning of January 22nd, Chelmsford took about half his force out on a reconnaissance mission, believing the main Zulu army was elsewhere. He left about 1,700 men, including regulars from the 24th Regiment of Foot, to defend the unfortified camp under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pullinan, an administrator with no combat experience. Later, a cavalry force under Colonel Anthony Durnford arrived, bringing the camp's defenders to around 1,800. Unknown to the British, a massive Zulu army of around 20,000 warriors, commanded by Singweo, Kamaholi Koza, and Mavumingwana Kentala Ntuli, had outmaneuvered Chelmsford and was concealed in a nearby valley. Around midday, the Zulus were discovered. They immediately launched their attack, advancing in their traditional horns of the buffalo formation, a central chest with two horns to encircle the enemy. The British defenders, caught by surprise and spread out, struggled to form a cohesive firing line. Ammunition supply became a problem. The standard British ammunition boxes were screwed shut and difficult to open quickly under pressure. Some accounts suggest quartermasters were reluctant to issue ammunition without proper authorization, even as the battle raged. The Zulus, despite taking heavy casualties from British rifle fire, pressed their attack with incredible courage and discipline. They absorbed the volleys and kept coming. The sheer number of Zulus eventually overwhelmed the British lines. The horns of the Zulu formation closed in, and the battle descended into brutal hand-to-hand combat. The British soldiers, outmaneuvered and outnumbered, were overrun. Within a few hours, the camp was a scene of slaughter. Over 1,300 British and colonial troops were killed, including Pullen and Durnford. Only a few dozen Europeans escaped. The Zulus also suffered heavy losses, perhaps as many as 1,000 to 3,000 killed, but they had achieved a stunning victory. They captured rifles, ammunition, and supplies. When Lord Chelmsford returned to Isandlwana later that day, he was met with a scene of utter devastation. The Battle of Isandlwana was one of the worst defeats ever inflicted on a modern European army by an indigenous force. It sent shockwaves through Britain and the Empire. While the British eventually regrouped and defeated the Zulu kingdom later that year, Isandlwana remained a stark reminder of the Zulus' fighting prowess and a humiliating blow to British military prestige. Number 10. Waterloo, 1815. Napoleon's last stand. After his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 and defeat at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, had been forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. But in March 1815, he escaped, landed in France, and began the 100 Days, a period where he rapidly regained power. The great powers of Europe, who had just finished redrawing the map after years of Napoleonic wars, quickly formed the Seventh Coalition to stop him. Napoleon decided to strike first. He marched his new army into Belgium, hoping to defeat the Allied armies, a British-led multinational force under the Duke of Wellington, and a Prussian army under Gebhard von Blücher, separately before they could unite. On June 16, Napoleon defeated Blücher at the Battle of Ligny, while Marshal Ney fought Wellington to a draw at Quatre Bras. Wellington withdrew to a strong defensive position along a ridge near the village of Waterloo. Napoleon, believing the Prussians were retreating away from Wellington, dispatched Marshal Grouchy with 33,000 men to pursue them. This decision would prove costly. On the morning of June 18, 1815, Napoleon faced Wellington's army of about 68,000 men. Napoleon had around 72,000. The battle was delayed for several hours due to heavy rain the previous night, which softened the ground, making it difficult for Napoleon to effectively deploy his artillery, one of his key strengths. When the battle finally began around 11:30 a.m., French attacks focused on key fortified positions held by Wellington's troops: the chateau of Hougoumont on the Allied right flank, and the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte in the center. These positions were fiercely defended and drew in many French troops. Later in the afternoon, Marshal Ney, mistaking some Allied troop movements for a retreat, launched massive, unsupported cavalry charges against Wellington's infantry squares. The British and Allied infantry held firm, forming squares that repelled wave after wave of French horsemen, inflicting heavy losses. Meanwhile, unknown to Napoleon, for some time, Blücher's Prussians, instead of retreating east, as Napoleon had assumed, were marching to join Wellington. They began arriving on Napoleon's right flank in the late afternoon, forcing him to commit vital reserves to hold them off. The French did manage to capture La Haye-Sainte in the early evening, putting severe pressure on Wellington's center. Wellington himself was heard to say, "Night or the Prussians must come." Just as Napoleon was preparing his elite Imperial Guard for a final, decisive assault on Wellington's weakened center, more Prussians arrived, strengthening the Allied line and further threatening Napoleon's flank and rear. The Imperial Guard attacked, but they were met by determined Allied resistance, and after fierce fighting were repulsed. Seeing the Guard retreat, a cry of "La Garde recule," the Guard recoil psalm, went through the French ranks, shattering their morale. Wellington ordered a general advance, and the French army broke and fled in disarray. Napoleon himself narrowly escaped capture. The French lost around 25,000 killed or wounded, and many thousands captured. Coalition forces suffered around 22,000 casualties. The Battle of Waterloo was Napoleon's final decisive defeat. He abdicated again 4 days later and was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he died in 1821. The battle ended over 2 decades of warfare that had convulsed Europe. Number 9. Saratoga, 1777. A British army surrenders, and the world takes note. In the summer of 1777, during the American Revolutionary War, British military planners devised a strategy to crush the rebellion. The plan involved General John Burgoyne, leading an army south from Canada down the Hudson River Valley to Albany, New York. Another British force, under General William Howe, was supposed to move north from New York City to meet him, effectively cutting off New England, the heart of the rebellion, from the other colonies. Burgoyne's expedition started well. He captured Fort Ticonderoga with ease, but his advance soon bogged down. His army, laden with heavy artillery and a huge baggage train, including Burgoyne's personal champagne, struggled through the dense wilderness of upstate New York. American forces, under commanders like General Philip Schuyler and later General Horatio Gates, felled trees to block roads, destroyed bridges, and harassed the British column. Supplies ran low for Burgoyne. A detachment sent to Bennington, Vermont, to find supplies was decisively defeated by American militia. Crucially, General Howe, instead of moving north to support Burgoyne, decided to capture the American capital of Philadelphia, leaving Burgoyne isolated and unsupported. By September, Burgoyne's army, now numbering around 7,000, reached the vicinity of Saratoga near Albany. Facing them was a growing American army, swelled by militia under General Gates. The Americans had fortified a strong position on Bemis Heights. On September 19th, Burgoyne attacked the American left wing at Freeman's Farm. The fighting was intense, with British regulars pushing back the Americans, but at a heavy cost. Benedict Arnold, still fighting for the American side at this point, played a key role in rallying the American troops. Burgoyne's army suffered significant casualties and gained little ground. He waited for reinforcements from New York City that never came. His situation grew desperate. Food was scarce. His Native American allies deserted him, and his men were exhausted. On October 7th, Burgoyne launched another attack, a reconnaissance in force, against the American left at Bemis Heights. This attack was decisively repulsed. Benedict Arnold, defying Gates' orders, rode into the battle and led a series of furious assaults that broke the British lines and captured key redoubts. Arnold himself was severely wounded in the leg. Surrounded, outnumbered, with no hope of relief, and his supply lines cut, Burgoyne had no choice. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered his entire army, nearly 6,000 men, to General Gates. The news of the American victory at Saratoga was a stunning blow to the British and a tremendous boost to American morale. More importantly, it had a decisive impact on international politics. The victory convinced France, a longtime rival of Britain, that the Americans had a genuine chance of winning the war. In February 1778, France formally recognized American independence and signed a treaty of alliance, providing crucial military and financial support to the American cause. Spain and the Netherlands later joined France in supporting the Americans. The Battle of Saratoga is widely considered the major turning point of the American Revolutionary War because it brought in this vital foreign assistance that ultimately helped secure American independence. Number 8. Mohawks, 1526. A kingdom dies in an afternoon. In the early 16th century, the Kingdom of Hungary found itself on the Phelan pen of Christian Europe's defense against the expanding Ottoman Empire, led by the formidable Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent. Young King Louis II of Hungary was faced with a massive Ottoman invasion force in the summer of 1526. Suleiman, with an army estimated at 50,000 to 65,000 men, including elite Janissary infantry and powerful artillery, was marching north into Hungary. King Louis, despite appeals for help from other European powers, managed to gather a much smaller army, around 25,000 to 30,000 men. His forces were a mix of Hungarian nobles and their retinues, mercenaries, and peasant levies. The Hungarian command was also divided, and there was disagreement on strategy. Some advocated for a defensive war waiting for reinforcements, while others, led by the influential Archbishop Paul Tamori, favored an immediate, decisive battle. The Hungarians chose to make their stand on a large open plain near the town of Mohacs, in southern Hungary, not far from the Danube River. The terrain seemed suitable for their heavy cavalry, which was considered the strength of their army. On August 29, 1526, the two armies met. The Hungarians, despite being outnumbered, decided to attack. Their plan relied on their heavily armored knights delivering a crushing charge to break the Ottoman lines before the full weight of Ottoman numbers and firepower could be brought to bear. The initial Hungarian cavalry charge on the right wing had some success, pushing back the Ottoman Rumelian, European cavalry. However, the Ottoman center, composed of Janissaries, supported by artillery, held firm. Suleiman had arranged his forces cleverly. The Janissaries were entrenched behind a defensive line, and the Ottoman artillery was well positioned to decimate any attackers. As the Hungarian infantry and the remaining cavalry advanced, they were met with devastating volleys from Ottoman cannons and Janissary muskets. The disciplined Janissaries, fighting from prepared positions, cut down the attacking Hungarians. The Hungarian army, lacking coordination and facing superior numbers and firepower, began to disintegrate. The battle turned into a rout. Many Hungarian nobles and knights were killed as they fought bravely, but futilely. King Louis II himself fled the battlefield, but, according to traditional accounts, fell from his horse while trying to cross the Sale stream and drowned, weighed down by his armor. The losses for the Hungarians were catastrophic. In just a few hours, the core of the Hungarian army was annihilated. Estimates suggest that 14,000 to 20,000 Hungarian soldiers were killed, including the king, 7 bishops, 28 barons, and a huge portion of the Hungarian nobility. The Ottoman losses were much lighter. The Battle of Mohacs was a disaster for Hungary. The death of the king without an heir led to a succession crisis and civil war. Much of the kingdom was subsequently conquered by the Ottomans, who occupied central Hungary, including the capital Buda, for over 150 years. Other parts of Hungary came under Habsburg rule. The battle effectively marked the end of the independent medieval kingdom of Hungary and shifted the balance of power in Central Europe significantly in favor of the Ottoman Empire. Number 7. The Spanish Armada, 1588. God blew, and they were scattered. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain, the most powerful ruler in Europe, launched a massive naval expedition, the Gran Armada, or Invincible Armada, to invade England. His goals were to overthrow the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, restore Catholicism to England, and stop English privateering against Spanish treasure fleets and colonies. The Armada consisted of about 130 ships, including powerful galleons and transport vessels, carrying around 8,000 sailors and 18,000 soldiers. The plan was for the Armada, commanded by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a nobleman with little naval experience, to sail up the English Channel, rendezvous with an army of 30,000 veteran Spanish troops under the Duke of Parma, and then ferry Parma's army across the Channel to invade England. The English, under the command of Lord Howard of Effingham, with experienced captains like Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Hawkins, had a smaller but more maneuverable fleet. Their ships were generally faster and had more long-range cannons than the Spanish galleons, which were designed more for close quarters combat and boarding. The Armada set sail from Lisbon in May 1588, but was hit by storms and had to regroup. It finally entered the English Channel in late July. The English fleet engaged the Armada in a series of skirmishes as it sailed eastwards. The English tactics were to use their superior speed and gunnery to damage the Spanish ships from a distance, avoiding the close quarters fighting that the Spanish preferred. The Spanish maintained a tight crescent formation, which was difficult for the English to break. The Armada anchored off Calais in France, waiting to hear from the Duke of Parma. However, Parma's army was not ready. They lacked sufficient transport barges and were blockaded by Dutch flyboats, shallow draft warships allied with England. This was a critical failure in Spanish planning and coordination. On the night of July 28th, August 7th, by the Gregorian calendar used by Spain, the English launched a daring attack. They sent 8 fireships, old vessels filled with combustibles, and set alight, drifting on the wind and tide into the anchored Spanish fleet. Although the fireships didn't directly sink many Spanish vessels, they caused panic and chaos. To avoid the flames, many Spanish captains cut their anchor cables and their ships scattered, breaking their defensive formation. The next day, at the Battle of Gravelines, the English fleet attacked the now disorganized Spanish ships. The English were able to inflict significant damage on several Spanish galleons. The Spanish, with their formation broken and many ships damaged, were driven northwards by the prevailing winds. Medina Sidonia decided that a return through the Channel was too risky, so he opted to sail north around Scotland and Ireland, and then back to Spain. This voyage proved disastrous. The Armada encountered severe storms off the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Many ships were wrecked, and thousands of Spanish sailors and soldiers drowned or were killed by locals after struggling ashore. Only about 60 to 70 ships, battered and carrying starving and sick men, linked back to Spain. Estimates suggest that as many as 15,000 to 20,000 Spaniards died from battle, shipwreck, starvation, or disease. The defeat of the Armada was a significant blow to Spanish prestige and morale. While Spain remained a major global power for decades, the failure of the invasion attempt boosted English confidence and contributed to the rise of England as a major naval power. Many in England attributed their victory to divine intervention, with commemorative medals bearing the inscription Flavit Jehovah et dissipati sunt, God blew and they were scattered. Number 6. Tenochtitlan, 1519 to 1521. The fall of the eagle and serpent. In 1519, a small Spanish expedition, led by Hernán Cortés, landed on the coast of Mexico. Their goal was to explore, find gold, and claim lands for the Spanish crown. They soon learned of the mighty Aztec Empire, which dominated much of central Mexico from its magnificent capital city, Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was an incredible feat of engineering, built on an island in Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by causeways. It was a city of pyramids, palaces, and bustling markets, with a population estimated at 200,000 to 300,000 people, larger than most European cities at the time. The Aztec ruler was Moctezuma II. Cortés, with only a few hundred Spanish soldiers, cannons, horses, which were unknown in the Americas, and war dogs, began a daring march inland. He skillfully exploited political divisions within the Aztec Empire, forging alliances with indigenous groups like the Tlaxcalans, who were bitter enemies of the Aztecs and provided thousands of warriors to Cortés's cause. Cortés and his men reached Tenochtitlan in November 1519 and were initially welcomed by Moctezuma, perhaps out of curiosity, fear, or a belief that Cortés might be a returning deity. However, tensions soon rose. Cortés took Moctezuma hostage. In 1520, during Cortés' temporary absence from the city, his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado ordered a massacre of Aztec nobles and priests during a religious festival, fearing an uprising. This atrocity provoked a furious Aztec revolt. The Spanish and their allies found themselves besieged in the city. During what became known as La Noche Triste, the sad night, in June 1520, the Spanish attempted to flee Tenochtitlan under cover of darkness, but were discovered. They suffered heavy casualties as they fought their way out across the causeways, losing many men, horses, and looted treasure. Cortés, however, was not defeated. He retreated to Tlaxcala, regrouped, gathered more native allies, and planned a systematic siege of Tenochtitlan. Crucial, unintentional weapon the Spanish brought with them was smallpox. The disease to which the indigenous populations had no immunity swept through Tenochtitlan and the surrounding areas, killing vast numbers of Aztecs, including Moctezuma's successor, Cuitlahuac, and severely weakening their ability to resist. Cortés had small ships, brigantines, constructed and then disassembled, carried over land and reassembled on Lake Texcoco. These ships, armed with cannons, gave him control of the lake, cutting off supplies to Tenochtitlan and allowing him to attack the city from the water. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in May 1521. It was a brutal, protracted struggle. The Aztecs, now led by the young and determined Cuauhtémoc, fought with incredible bravery and desperation, defending their city street by street, house by house. The Spanish and their allies advanced slowly, destroying buildings as they went to deny cover to the defenders. The inhabitants of Tenochtitlan suffered terribly from starvation, thirst, and disease, in addition to the constant fighting. After nearly 3 months of relentless siege and horrific urban warfare, Tenochtitlan finally fell on August 13, 1521. Cuauhtémoc was captured. The city was almost completely destroyed. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the end of the Aztec Empire. On its ruins, the Spanish began to build Mexico City, which became the capital of New Spain. Conquest led to Spanish colonization of vast territories in the Americas, a massive demographic collapse of indigenous populations due to disease and exploitation, and a profound transformation of culture and society in the region. Number 5. Manzikert, 1071. An emperor captured. An empire breached. In the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire, the eastern successor to the Roman Empire, was a major power in the Mediterranean and Middle East. However, it faced a new and formidable threat from the east. The Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people who had converted to Islam and carved out a large empire. In the 1060s, Seljuk raiding parties began to penetrate deep into Byzantine Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, the heartland of the empire, rich in manpower and resources. The Byzantine emperor, Romanos IV Diogenes, a capable soldier, decided to lead a large army east to confront the Seljuks and secure the Byzantine frontier. In the summer of 1071, Romanos marched with an army estimated at 40,000 to 70,000 men, a diverse force including Byzantine regulars, Norman mercenaries, and other foreign contingents. His objective was to recapture key fortresses, including Manzikert, near Lake Van in eastern Anatolia. The Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan heard of the Byzantine advance. He had a smaller but highly mobile army, primarily composed of skilled horse archers, numbering perhaps 20,000 to 30,000. Alp Arslan, who was actually campaigning in Syria, quickly marched north to meet the Byzantines. Two armies met near Manzikert on August 26, 1071. Avernaus, confident in his numbers, arrayed his army for battle. Alp Arslan, possibly seeking to avoid a full-scale confrontation with the larger Byzantine force, offered peace terms, which Romanos rejected, perhaps seeing it as a sign of weakness. The battle began with Seljuk horse archers harassing the Byzantine lines, using their classic tactic of riding in, loosing arrows, and then retreating before the heavier Byzantine cavalry could engage them, the Parthian shot tactic. The Byzantines advanced, and by the afternoon, they had captured the Seljuk camp. However, as evening approached, Romanos ordered his forces to withdraw to their own camp for the night. This maneuver was poorly executed. Some Byzantine units misunderstood the order, and indiscipline spread. Critically, Andronikos Doukas, a political rival of Romanos who commanded the Byzantine reserve forces, allegedly spread a rumor that the emperor had fallen and deliberately withdrew his troops from the field, exposing the rest of the army. Seeing the confusion in the Byzantine ranks, Alp Arslan seized the opportunity and ordered a general attack. The Seljuks surrounded the Byzantine forces. The Byzantine army, already in disarray and now attacked from all sides, began to collapse. Many of the mercenary units fled or defected. Emperor Romanos IV fought bravely, but was eventually wounded and captured by the Seljuks. It was a shocking event. A Byzantine emperor taken prisoner by the enemy. Alp Arslan treated Romanos with respect. Peace treaty was signed, and Romanos was released after a ransom was agreed upon. However, when Romanos returned to Constantinople, he found that his enemies, led by the Doukas family, had seized power. He was overthrown, blinded, and exiled, dying shortly afterward from his injuries. The immediate military losses at Manzikert itself, while significant, were not utterly catastrophic in terms of numbers for the Byzantines. However, the capture of the emperor and the subsequent civil war within the Byzantine Empire created a power vacuum in Anatolia. The Seljuk, Turks, and other Turkic groups took advantage of this chaos and began to flood into Anatolia, settling the land. Within a few decades, much of Anatolia, the Byzantine Empire's most vital recruiting ground and source of wealth, was lost. The Battle of Manzikert is often seen as a pivotal moment that began the long decline of the Byzantine Empire, and facilitated the Turkic settlement of Anatolia, fundamentally changing the region's demography and culture. It was also one of the factors that prompted the Byzantines to appeal to Western Europe for military aid, contributing to the launch of the First Crusade. Number 4. Adrianople, 378 AD. An emperor vanishes, and Rome shakes. In the late 4th century AD, the Roman Empire was facing increasing pressure from Germanic tribes along its frontiers. In 376 AD, a large group of Goths, known as the Tervingi and Grautungi, fleeing from the advancing Huns, sought permission from the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens to cross the Danube River and settle in Roman territory in the Balkans. Valens agreed, hoping to use the Goths as foederati, allied troops, and agricultural workers. However, corrupt Roman officials, Lupicinus and Maximus, mistreated the Goths, exploiting them and failing to provide promised food and supplies. This led to widespread suffering and resentment among the Goths, who soon rose in rebellion. They began raiding and plundering the Roman province of Thrace. Emperor Valens, who was in the east dealing with Persian threats, decided to return to Constantinople and deal with the Gothic uprising personally. He gathered an army, though it was not at full strength, as he was eager for a quick victory before his nephew Gratian, the Western Roman Emperor, could arrive with reinforcements from the west and potentially steal the glory. Valens marched his army, estimated at 15,000 to 30,000 men, to confront the Goths, who were led by a capable chieftain named Fritigern. The Goths, whose numbers were possibly similar or slightly larger, had also been joined by other groups, including some Alans and Huns. On August 9, 378 AD, near the city of Adrianople, modern Edirne in Turkey, Valens, acting on faulty intelligence that suggested the Gothic force was smaller than it actually was, and eager to engage before Gratian arrived, decided to attack. His men had already marched for several hours in the summer heat, without adequate rest or water. The Romans deployed for battle. The Goths, meanwhile, had formed a defensive wagon, lager, a circle of wagons, on a hilltop. Fritigern employed delaying tactics, sending envoys to negotiate, possibly to bide time for his Grautungi cavalry, which was away foraging, to return. Valens, impatient and overconfident, launched his attack before his lines were fully formed and without proper reconnaissance. The Roman left-wing cavalry engaged the Goths, but the main Roman infantry assault was slow and disorganized. As the battle was joined, the Grautungi heavy cavalry, along with Alan horsemen, unexpectedly returned and smashed into the Roman left flank with devastating force. The Roman cavalry on that flank was routed and fled. This exposed the Roman infantry, who were now surrounded and attacked from multiple sides by the Gothic cavalry and infantry. The Roman lines, packed tightly together and struggling in the heat and dust, could not maneuver effectively. They were cut down in droves. Emperor Valens himself was reportedly in the thick of the fighting with his imperial guards. He was either killed on the field or, according to some accounts, wounded and carried to a nearby farmhouse, which the Goths then set on fire, burning him alive. His body was never found. The Battle of Adrianople was a catastrophic defeat for the Eastern Roman Empire. As much as 2/3 of the Eastern Roman field army, perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 experienced soldiers, were killed, along with many of its most senior officers. It was one of the worst military disasters in Roman history, often compared to Cannae. The loss of so many veteran troops was a blow from which the Eastern Roman army took a long time to recover. Following the battle, the victorious Goths were free to roam and plunder the Balkans, though they were unable to take fortified cities like Adrianople or Constantinople. The new Eastern Emperor, Theodosius I, eventually had to negotiate a settlement with the Goths, allowing them to settle within the empire as autonomous allies, a decision with long-term consequences for Roman policy towards barbarian groups. Adrianople highlighted the growing importance of heavy cavalry in warfare and demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional Roman infantry tactics to new barbarian threats. Number 3. Cannae, 216 BC. Hannibal's masterpiece, Rome's nightmare. During the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BC, between Rome and Carthage, the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca had invaded Italy and inflicted several stunning defeats on the Romans, notably at the Trebia River, 218 BC, and Lake Trasimene. The Romans, deeply alarmed, appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Fabius adopted a strategy of attrition known as the Fabian strategy, avoiding pitched battles with Hannibal, shadowing his army, and harassing his supply lines. This strategy, while militarily sound, was unpopular in Rome, where many clamored for a decisive victory. In 216 BC, new consuls were elected. Gaius Terentius Varro, who favored an aggressive approach, and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who was more cautious. They were given command of an enormous army, perhaps as many as 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, with instructions to confront Hannibal. Hannibal, whose army was smaller, around 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, many of whom were highly skilled Celts, Iberians, and Numidians, had maneuvered into Apulia in southern Italy and seized the large Roman supply depot at Cannae. This forced the Romans to seek him out. On August 2, 216 BC, the two armies met on a plain near the Aufidus River. Varro, who was in command that day, the consuls traditionally alternated command daily, chose to deploy his vastly superior infantry in a very deep, narrow formation, hoping to use sheer weight of numbers to punch through the Carthaginian center. Paulus reportedly advised against this deployment on such narrow ground, but Varro was determined. Hannibal arranged his forces brilliantly, placed his weaker Gallic and Spanish infantry in the center, bulging forward in a crescent shape towards the Romans. On their flanks, he positioned his veteran African heavy infantry in deep columns, slightly recessed. His superior cavalry was stationed on the wings. Hasdrubal, not Hannibal's brother, with the Spanish and Gallic heavy cavalry on the left, and Maharbal with the swift Numidian light cavalry on the right. As the battle began, the Roman legions advanced and smashed into Hannibal's extended center. As Hannibal had planned, his Gallic and Spanish infantry in the center slowly gave way, bending inwards under the Roman pressure. The Romans, believing they were breaking through, pushed deeper and deeper into the Carthaginian formation, which now formed a concave pocket. While the Roman infantry was focused on this apparent breakthrough, Hannibal's cavalry achieved decisive victories on both flanks. Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry on the Carthaginian left quickly shattered the Roman citizen cavalry opposite them, commanded by Paulus, and then, instead of pursuing them, wheeled around the rear of the Roman infantry to attack the allied Roman cavalry on the other wing, which was already engaged with Maharbal's Numidians. The Roman allied cavalry also broke and fled. With the Roman cavalry driven from the field, Hasdrubal's cavalry then charged into the rear of the densely packed Roman infantry. At the same time, Hannibal's African infantry on the flanks, which had not yet been engaged, turned inwards and attacked the Roman legions on both sides. The Romans were now completely surrounded, enveloped on all sides, trapped in a killing field. Panic and chaos ensued. Tightly packed Roman soldiers could barely use their weapons. What followed was a horrific slaughter that lasted for hours. Tens of thousands of Romans were cut down. Estimates of Roman losses vary, but many ancient sources suggest 50,000 to 70,000 Romans were killed, including the consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus, 29 military tribunes, and 80 senators or men of senatorial rank. Hannibal lost only around 6,000 men. Cannae was one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history, and a tactical masterpiece of encirclement by Hannibal. In the aftermath, many of Rome's allies in southern Italy defected to Carthage. Rome was in a state of panic. However, the Roman Republic, despite the devastating loss, refused to surrender. They raised new legions and eventually, after many more years of hard fighting, defeated Hannibal and won the war. The memory of Cannae haunted Rome for generations. Number 2. Carrhae, 53 BC. Crassus's greed. Parthia's triumph. Rome's humiliation. In 55 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome and a member of the first triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, became governor of Roman Syria. Despite his immense wealth and political power, he had famously defeated Spartacus's slave revolt. Crassus craved military glory to rival that of Caesar in Gaul and Pompey in the east. He decided to launch an unprovoked invasion of the Parthian Empire, a powerful kingdom centered in Persia, modern Iran, that controlled vast territories east of Roman Syria. Crassus assembled a large army of 7 legions, around 35,000 to 44,000 heavy infantry, along with 4,000 light infantry and 4,000 cavalry, including 1,000 Gallic horsemen led by his brave son Publius Crassus. In the spring of 53 BC, Crassus marched his army from Syria into Parthian Mesopotamia. He ignored the advice of experienced officers, including his legate Cassius Longinus, later one of Caesar's assassins, who suggested a more cautious route along the Euphrates River or through friendly Armenia. Instead, Crassus, eager for a quick confrontation, and possibly misled by an Arab chieftain who was secretly allied with the Parthians, plunged directly into the arid, open desert. The Parthian king, Orodes II, divided his forces. He personally led an army to deal with Armenia, while he sent his brilliant young general Shurna with a much smaller force, primarily around 9,000 horse archers and 1,000 cataphracts, heavily armored lancers on armored horses, to harass and delay Crassus. Near the town of Carrhae, modern Harran, Turkey, Shurna's small but highly mobile army encountered Crassus's legions. The Romans, expecting a traditional infantry battle, were unprepared for Parthian tactics. The Parthian horse archers, riding swift horses, surrounded the Roman formations which Crassus had deployed into a large hollow square. They unleashed a relentless storm of arrows from their powerful composite bows, inflicting casualties and disrupting the Roman ranks. When the Romans tried to advance, the horse archers would feign retreat, the Parthian shot, turning in their saddles to fire arrows backwards while withdrawing, only to return and resume their attack once the Romans halted. The Romans found it impossible to close with them. Parthians seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of arrows, resupplied by camels from the rear. The Roman legionaries, weighed down by their armor and shields, suffered terribly under the hail of arrows and the scorching desert sun. Crassus sent his son Publius with the Gallic cavalry and other troops to drive off the horse archers. Publius charged, and the Parthians feigned retreat, luring him away from the main Roman army. Once Publius was isolated, the Parthians, including their cataphracts, turned and overwhelmed his force. Publius fought bravely but was killed, and his head was reportedly cut off and displayed on a spear to taunt the remaining Romans. Seeing his son's head, Crassus was devastated. The main Roman army continued to suffer. As night fell, the Parthians withdrew, but the Romans were demoralized, short of water, and had suffered heavy casualties. The next day, Crassus attempted to retreat, but his army was hounded by the Parthians. Eventually, Shurna offered to negotiate. Crassus, pressured by his mutinous troops, reluctantly agreed to meet Shurna. During the parley, a scuffle broke out, and Crassus was killed. What happened to Crassus's body is a matter of legend. One famous story, though likely apocryphal, claims the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat, a symbolic gesture mocking his notorious greed. The Battle of Carrhae was a disaster for Rome. Around 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed, and another 10,000 were captured and possibly settled in the Eastern Parthian Empire. Several legionary eagle standards, symbols of Roman honor, were lost to the Parthians, a profound humiliation. The defeat halted Roman expansion eastward for a considerable time and established the Parthian Empire as a formidable rival to Rome. The loss of Crassus also upset the balance of power in the First Triumvirate, contributing to the growing tensions between Caesar and Pompey that would eventually lead to civil war. Number 1. Teutoburg Forest, 9 AD. 3 legions vanish into the trees. In the early 1st century AD, the Roman Empire, under Emperor Augustus, was seeking to expand its frontiers in Germania, modern Germany, beyond the Rhine River, aiming to consolidate control up to the Elbe River. Publius Quintilius Varus, an experienced administrator, but perhaps less distinguished as a military commander, was appointed governor of the newly conquered province of Germania in 7 AD. He set about imposing Roman taxation and law, which caused resentment among the Germanic tribes who valued their independence. Among Varus's advisors was a young Germanic nobleman named Arminius Hermann, a prince of the Cherusci tribe. Arminius had served in the Roman army, gained Roman citizenship, and even achieved equestrian rank. He was outwardly loyal to Rome, but secretly he was plotting a massive rebellion. He united several Germanic tribes in a conspiracy to ambush the Romans. In September of 9 AD, Varus was leading 3 of Rome's finest legions, the XBI, XVII, and XIX, along with auxiliary units and camp followers, a force totaling perhaps 20,000 to 25,000 people, from their summer encampment near the Reser River back to their winter quarters near the Reser River back to their winter quarters near the Rhine. As they marched, Arminius, who was with Varus, brought reports of a localized revolt nearby. He persuaded Varus to deviate from the planned route and march through unfamiliar, densely wooded and swampy territory in the Teutoburg Forest. The exact location is still debated by historians, but Calcres Henneday. Arminius then excused himself, saying he would gather allied Germanic forces to support the Romans. Instead, he went to join the Germanic warriors he had already assembled, who were lying in wait. The Roman column stretched out for several miles along narrow, muddy tracks, encumbered by baggage and bad weather. Heavy rain had set in, was a perfect target for ambush. The Germanic tribesmen, hidden in the dense forest and familiar with the terrain, launched their attack. They rained javelins and other missiles down on the unsuspecting Romans, then charged out to engage in close-quarters combat. The Romans, caught by surprise in difficult terrain where they could not effectively form their battle lines or use their superior discipline and tactics, struggled to defend themselves. The fighting was brutal and lasted for 3 days. The Romans tried to build a fortified camp each night, but they were constantly harassed. They attempted to break out, but the Germanic warriors, guided by Arminius, who understood Roman tactics, relentlessly attacked them, targeting weak points and cutting off stragglers. The Roman formations began to disintegrate. Casualties mounted. Varus himself, seeing the situation was hopeless and facing certain capture, chose to fall on his own sword, committing suicide. Many of his officers followed his example. The remnants of the 3 legions were overwhelmed and annihilated. Very few Romans escaped the slaughter. The 3 coveted legionary eagle standards were captured by the Germanic tribes, a devastating blow to Roman prestige and honor. News of the disaster, known as the Varian disaster, Clades Variana, in Rome, threw Emperor Augustus into a state of profound grief and anger. Suetonius, the Roman historian, wrote that Augustus would bang his head against a door, crying, "Quintilli ver legiones reda, quintilius varus, give me back my legions." The loss of 3 entire legions and so many experienced soldiers was a massive military setback. Rome launched several punitive expeditions into Germania in the following years under commanders like Germanicus, who managed to recover 2 of the lost eagle standards and inflict defeats on the Germanic tribes. However, the Romans never again attempted a large-scale conquest and permanent occupation of Germania beyond the Rhine. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest effectively halted Roman expansion into northern Europe and established the Rhine as the long-term frontier between the Roman world and the Germanic tribal lands. The victory was a defining moment for Germanic identity and independence. The 3 lost legion numbers XVI, XVIII, and XIX were never used again by the Roman army.